Okay, so we finished chapter 18, which talks about the factor market. Remember that factor market basically means the market for firm inputs. And we specifically talked about three kinds of inputs. The first is labor. The second is land. And the third is capital. And our focus was on labor. So the main tool we use is actually, again, about this demand curve and supply curve. So here you can see that this is the demand curve for labor, right? In the market for labor, firm demands labor. So in this case, you can see that the demand curve is actually derived from the firm's profit maximization behavior. To be more specific, you can see that this demand curve is determined by the value of marginal product, which is the product price times the marginal product of the input. And then we would combine the supply curve and demand curve. Then we could determine what is the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium quantity. And of course, we could also talk about how shifts in the supply curve and the demand curve will affect equilibrium quantity. Obviously, to understand this, you need to understand all kinds of factors which could affect or change demand curve and supply curve. So let's today finish chapter 18 by finishing these true-false problems. The value of the marginal product of labor can be calculated as the price of the final good minus the marginal product of labor. So this one essentially talks about what is the definition of the value of the marginal product of labor, right? And we know that VMP is price times marginal product. And because we're talking about labor here, so we could use this little capital L to indicate labor. So, and then the problem says price of the final good minus the marginal product. So clearly this one is false. Capital owners are compensated according to the value of the marginal product of that capital. We discussed this at the end of the last chapter. So basically, the determination of wage and the determination of the rental price for capital owners, they're essentially the same. In the end, the rental price should be equal to the value of the marginal product, right? So this one should be true here. Third, in a competitive market for labor, the equilibrium wage equals the value of marginal product. Well, that's definitely true. So basically, this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve. In the equilibrium, we will have a wage. And then the wage has to be equal to value of marginal product because the demand curve is determined by the value of marginal product. Technological advances can cause the labor demand curve to shift. Well, this is definitely true, right? So we actually discussed two kinds of technologies. The first is labor augmenting. So it means this kind of technology will actually make labor more productive. So this will actually move the demand curve to the right. And then we talk about the second kind of technology, which is labor substitution, right? So in this case, for example, robots. These kinds of innovations could replace human labor. And in this case, you can imagine that the demand curve will shift to the left. right? So in this case, you can see that the fourth true-false problem is the answer here is true. As the rental price of capital decreases, more capital is used in production, and the marginal product of capital increases. So first it says, if rental price of capital decreases, then more capital will be used in production. This one basically talks about the demand curve, and we know that the demand curve for factors including labor or capital is downward sloping, right? So in this case, you can see that if the price decreases, you can see that the amount of labor used will increase. And then it says the marginal product of capital increases. So this part is incorrect, because we know that as you increase the amount of capital in your production, the marginal product has to be decreasing, right? Because of the diminishing marginal product result we have discussed in previous chapters. Okay, now let's talk about the sixth problem. The quantity available of one factor of production can affect the marginal product of other factors. Well, this is right? Think about the example we discussed in the last class about the apple farm, right? We know that there are two factors of production, ladders and workers. If we have only a few ladders, then you can imagine that the productivity of those apple farmers will actually quite low. In this case, you can see that yes, the quantity available of one factor of production will affect the marginal product of other factors. Okay, seventh, a competitive profit maximization firm hires workers up to the point at which the wage equals the price of the final good. So what you can see here is it says the profit maximization condition is wage equals the price of the final good. It's definitely not right? Because we know that the profit maximization condition for the firm is wage equals the value of marginal product. So this is false. Okay, eighth, changes in supply and demand in the labor market will cause changes in wage. Wow, this one is like obvious, because we know that wage is determined by the market equilibrium, and market equilibrium is affected by the changes in supply and demand. Okay, the last one. Oil field workers' wages are tied to the world price of oil. This one is definitely true, because we learned several factors which could affect the demand curve for labor. And we know that one of the three factors is the price of the final product, Because we know that if demand curve is determined by the value of the marginal product, then we know that if the final product price increases, the value of marginal product will increase. So we will have to move the demand curve upward. So basically you can see that the demand curve for the labor will move. And then if we have a supply curve like this, you can see that, of course, the wage will change. Okay, now let's discuss chapter 19, which further talks about earnings. This is the last chapter we will talk about in this whole semester. and we will actually talk about the final exam, and we will briefly review what we have learned in this semester in the next lecture. So you can see that in the last chapter we talked about the factor market, and in that chapter a major focus was how wage is determined, right? Put it simply, it's just by the market equilibrium in the labor market. And of course, when you talk about market equilibrium, you have to talk about the demand curve and the supply curve. And we learned that demand curve is determined by this value of marginal product, right? Demand curve, supply curve, then this gives us the wage and the quantity. And then supply curve, or in the market of the labor, workers or households, they are sellers. And then firms are actually buyers, right? So today we continue to talk about earnings or salaries. We will talk about some additional factors which affect workers' earnings. It's actually a very simple chapter, but it's very interesting, and it actually touches some more recent research. So first, if you observe, if you look at the real world, right, you can see that there is a huge difference among peoples about their earnings, right? So if you look at a data, I actually forget where I got these data, but you can see that for this, so what is this? Psychiatrists, yeah. So for them, right, for this kind of job, your average pay is about $182,000 per year. And then you can see some other jobs average earnings, right? You have for example chief executives, and then you also have dentists, right? And you have marketing managers. That's interesting. Lawyers. And then you can see that the wage can go as low as $18,000 for fast food cooks, right? So basically you can see that the difference is huge. I mean, it's $180,000 versus $18,000, right? The difference is tenfold, right? And then you could also look at wage differences between different genders or colors, right? You can see that this is US data. You can see that in the US, for white men, the wage is $47,000 average. For black men, it's $37,000. It's actually pretty, the difference is quite large, right? It's, you can see that the percentage earnings for the percentage earnings for black workers are actually 21% lower, right? And then you could see this cross-gender difference, right? You can see that among white workers, and the difference between men and women, their earnings have a difference of 24%. So now our goal is to understand what kind of factors could determine these huge differences, right? This is actually a very important research in modern economics. In labor economics, a large set of literature discusses this. So if you have interest, you could pursue a career, pursue some research goals on this kind of topic. So in this chapter, as I said, we will try to understand this kind of wide variation in earnings. Okay, so we will first discuss some additional determinants of equilibrium wages, because in the last chapter we only used the demand curve, supply curve to talk about the determination of wages in a very generic way. So now let's go deeper and talk about several other factors or determinants. So we will try to understand the different characteristics of jobs and workers, how these characteristics will actually affect wages. Basically, you can see that workers, they're different, right? They could be different in their age or gender or experience or education. And then for different jobs, you definitely have different kinds of attributes, right? So some job possibly will give you better safety or higher prestige, or maybe some job will offer you a better location, right? So basically you can see that if you think about jobs have these different attributes, right? So they could pay you well, or these jobs could offer you some non-monetary attributes. Now first we talk about the first reason which could determine wages. This is called compensating differentials. So basically when a worker is thinking about taking a job, the worker will not only think about the salary, right? Salary is just one big important factor. Besides salary, the worker could consider some non-monetary features of this job, such as whether this job is interesting, right? Whether this job is safe, whether it is exciting, whether it serves some noble purpose, right? And you can imagine that if a job offers safety, offers excitement, and offers some noble purposes, then you can imagine that the supply for this kind of good jobs will actually be larger, right? Because workers, they will prefer this kind of jobs with safety, with excitement, with noble purposes. So this basically implies that if you think about the demand curve and the supply curve, you can see that jobs with better or higher non-monetary features, their supply curve will actually shift to the right compared with jobs without non-monetary features. So this essentially means that good jobs will have lower equilibrium wages compared with bad jobs. That is, if you, this essentially says workers, they could potentially sacrifice for lower wage compensation if this job offers some other additional benefits, such as safety or excitement. So you can think about an example. Let's say you have a job and you have two choices. The first choice is you can work the night shift, or you could work the day shift. I guess most of the time, right, people will actually prefer the day shift if wages are the same. So this essentially implies that if the firm wants to hire workers for working the night shift, then the wages have to be higher for workers working the night shift, right? So this is called compensating differential. Essentially, this is the difference in wages, which arises because of non-monetary benefits. And you can imagine that if a job is desirable, that is, if the job offers positive non-monetary characteristics, or there are some additional benefits from this job, then you can imagine that this job's compensating differential should be negative. And if a job is, let's say, is risky, right? Or this job has some other undesirable attributes, then you can imagine that firms have to pay a premium in wages to attract workers. So in this case, compensating differential should be positive. Okay, now let's see several examples about the compensating differentials. So the fact is, you can see that generally coal miners, they have higher wages compared with workers with similar levels of education. So you can see that this higher wage can be considered as a compensating differential. The reason is because coal miners, they work in this dangerous environment, right? And they could suffer from long-term health problems. So the mining firms have to offer them higher wages. That is, their job have to have positive compensating differential. Under this positive compensating differential, workers will be willing to work for coal miners. Will be willing to work for coal mining firms. And the second example is about economics professors. So generally, if you have a PhD in economics, you can either choose to be a economics professor, or you could work for some banks. If you look at the wage difference, most of the time, economics professors, they have lower wage compared with a economist working for a bank. So basically, you can see that economics professors, they have negative compensating differential. The reason is because you can consider this job, that is being a professor, offers some desirable attributes, right? Such as you can just work on your own, and you can dictate what time you want to work, and you could potentially get some intellectual satisfaction from your research. So because of these positive attributes from being a professor, so essentially economics professors, they will be willing to accept a lower wage compared with their counterparts at banks. Okay, the second factor which could affect wage is human capital. This is quite easy to understand. So first, what is human capital? Well, it's the accumulation of investments in workers, such as education or on-the-job training. So essentially, if you go from high school to college, then you're advancing in your education. And during this process, you're also accumulating your human capital. So if you're a college graduate, then generally your human capital is considered to be higher compared with a high school graduate. The underlying assumption is during the process of obtaining your education, you're accumulating knowledge and different kinds of skills. And then on-the-job training will also offer higher human capital. So basically, you could learn by doing, or you could get training purposely from your employers, right? And in the process of the on-the-job training, you could become better at dealing with tasks from your job. So again, this could improve or increase your human capital. And human capital will definitely affect your earnings. And you can imagine that generally, if you have higher human capital, then your earnings will be higher. So this is a picture about the ratio of earnings between male university graduates and male high school graduates in Canada. So in both Canada and the US. So what you can see here is the ratio. The ratio is always above 1. I guess it's about 1.36, right? So you can see that on average, male university graduates earn at least, right, 36% more compared with male high school graduates. And then you could also see that for Canada, this ratio actually somewhat decreases. I don't know why, but this is actually quite interesting, right? If you look at US, the ratio actually increases, right? So maybe partially due to the US actually has larger inequality, right? That could potentially be the reason. Okay. Now, so why do education and on-the-job training can raise wages? Well, it's really because, again, we could think about the equilibrium market for labor. So we have supply and demand curve is determined by value of marginal product. So it's the product price times marginal product. So through education and on-the-job training, you could imagine that workers could become more productive. This means marginal product should be higher, right? So this implies that the the demand curve will shift to the right. So this basically means wage should be higher, right? So you can see that on average, education indeed pays off. Okay. Now, let's talk about the third factor. So the third factor is about it talks about ability, effort, and chance. And I would say this is somewhat obvious. It basically says that if you have higher ability, then your wage tends to be higher. And if you work harder, then your wage tends to be higher. And if you're luckier, then your wage tends to be higher, right? So this one is actually pretty easy to understand. Okay, let's look at what the textbook tried to say here. First, about ability. So the result that you will get higher wage if you have higher ability looks quite obvious, right? But you can see that this kind of argument could be powerful because you could use this to explain a lot of wage differences. So think about sports, right? So why do Major League Baseball players, they have higher wage compared with minor league players? Well, first you can see that this is not because of compensating differential, right? Compensating differential because compensating differential arises from non-monetary benefits, such as the satisfaction or safety or excitement you get from your job. And you can see that playing in the major league is not a less pleasant job compared with in the minor league, right? So there's no way that players in major league should earn a positive compensating differential. So that's why compensating differential cannot be considered as a reason to explain why these players in major league get higher pay. And then education, right, or on-the-job training should not play a big factor because major leagues do not require more years of education or more experience. So you can imagine that talent or ability actually determines the differences in their pay, right? So you can imagine that players in the major leagues, they are more talented, right? So they have larger or they have better, higher natural ability. And then effort. Well, as I said, if you work harder, you could get promoted quicker. Then you could, on average, you will get higher salary, right? And then luck is also tremendously important. There were actually several different research papers. So the general finding is if you entered the job market in a recession, then obviously, most likely, you would have to take a low-paying job. And the finding is this low-paying job will have this lingering effect. And years after your first low-paying job, you would still suffer from this first bad job. So in this case, you can see that you had to suffer from several years simply because you're unlucky. You entered into this job market at a bad time when the economy was in a recession. Okay, so we basically talk about three major factors, right? Compensating differentials. And second, the human capital. And third, ability or luck or your effort, whether you work hard. And now we talk about another reason, which is done by several research papers. So there's a research in 1993. It's actually a pretty famous research. So it's called Beauty at the Labor Market. So the general finding is beauty actually pays. So they find out good-looking people, they earn 5% more than average-looking people. And then average-looking people earn 5 to 10% more than plain-looking people. I have to say this, plain-looking people is an interesting name. I mean, average-looking, plain-looking. What's the difference? I guess plain-looking people, they have worse look compared with average-looking people. And then they also find out this kind of beauty premium effect is actually larger for men compared with women. And they find out unattractive women are less likely than others to participate in the labor force and are more likely to be married to men with unexpected low human capital. This is pretty much I mean, a, a paper which tells you this interesting fact that how it looks actually matters in your job performance, right? So it's a novel research, I would say. Okay, now let's talk about a theory which says why education can benefit workers. So the first reason comes to your mind has to be like this. Well, through education, you will get higher human capital, and human capital will increase your marginal product, which means in the end, you will have a higher wage, right? And then there is a particular theory which says education have this additional effect about signaling. So the theory goes like this. If you can get a higher degree, if you have higher education, then this implies that you have a higher innate ability. You're more talented. So maybe the education itself does not make you more productive, but education reveals that you're a smart, talented person. So education here serves as a signaling mechanism which reveals your ability, and firms they understand this. So after saying that you're highly educated, they will conjecture that you're a smart person, so they will be happy to hire you, right? So this is the signaling theory. Okay, next, the superstar phenomenon. So this is a important phenomenon in the labor market proposed by the Chicago economist Gary Becker. If you look at real life, you can see something like this. Think about actors. So we know that famous actors, they get extremely high compensation, right? Millions or potentially more than millions per year. But if you go to LA, and you can see that there are a lot of actors, they actually earn very little, and they have to take jobs as waiters to support themselves. And you could also see this same kind of phenomenon in the, among singers, right? So most singers were rock bands. They can only make a living in a bar, right? But famous ones, they will again earn millions or more than millions per year. So you can see that the difference in their compensation is huge. That is, if you think about the top 10 actors, their compensation would be so many times compared with the bottom 10 actors, right? So why do we see a huge difference like this? So this is called superstar phenomenon. That is, superstars in this labor market, they obtain huge compensations compared with non-superstars. You might wonder, why do these famous actors, famous singers, or famous athletes, they can earn so much? Is it just because they're better than other actors or singers? Well, the answer is no. Think about this. Obviously, in city of Winnipeg, we have some good carpenters, right? And you can imagine that these good carpenters, they will actually earn more than mediocre ones. And we also have some good plumbers. And these guys, they will, again, earn more than mediocre ones. However, you can see that the best carpenters or the best plumbers. They will not earn millions of dollars. So essentially, you can think about these different kinds of industries, right? So in the industry of singers, best ones earn millions, worst ones earn very little. But then in the industry of carpenters, the earnings is more equal, right? Indeed, the best ones can earn more, but it's not so much more, right? So why do we see such kind of differences across different industries? Well, um, if you want to understand this difference, you have to understand the specific features of these superstar markets. Um, the market for actors and singers, these are superstar markets. That is, markets which could contain superstars. Um, these kinds of markets have two features. First, every customer in the market wants to enjoy the product supplied by the best producer, right? Think about this. If you watch movie, you will generally only want to watch best movies you like. You won't want to watch the 50th ranked movies, right? Maybe you would just want to watch the movie ranked top or second or third. You won't want a movie ranked like 60th, right? And then the second feature is the product is produced with a technology which makes it possible for the best producer to supply every customer at low cost. So this is important. So the second feature is actually the very unique feature of the superstar market. The first feature is not so important because you can imagine that even in the market for carpenters, everybody will want the best carpenter. But you can see that the second feature is really important because think about the market for singers, right? So basically you can see that the best singer can supply every customer very easily because you can make copies of different songs at almost zero marginal cost, right? Think about the market for carpenters. Now it is different. Essentially, you can see that even people want the best carpenters, but it is very hard. Sorry, I should not use it is very hard. It is impossible for the best carpenter to work for everybody in a city, right? Because delivering the carpenter's service to customers is very expensive. You essentially have to drive to your customer's house and work for him, right? Or her. So you can see that marginal cost of production here actually plays a very important role. Essentially, the marginal cost for production in the superstar market is almost zero. So that's why the best seller in the superstar market can supply everyone. And that's why the best seller in the superstar market can earn millions. Okay. Now let's talk about the above equilibrium wages. So, if you think about the basic theory about wage determination, it's about the supply and demand. It's about how wage is determined by the equilibrium in the market for labor. However, sometimes for some workers, their wages are actually set above the equilibrium wage. Right? So why do we observe this kind of result? There are three reasons. The first is because of the minimum wage laws, and the second is about labor unions, and the third is due to efficiency wage. The minimum wage laws has been actually discussed in the beginning of this semester. So essentially you can see that if wage is here, and then the government can impose a binding minimum wage. So if the binding minimum wage is here, right, you can see that if the minimum wage is above the equilibrium wage, then in the end, wage in the market will be higher than the equilibrium wage due to this minimum wage laws. And then it's also easy to understand the market power of labor unions, right? Essentially because labor unions, they have huge collective bargaining power. So they can actually raise or force the firm to raise wages above the equilibrium level, because they can basically tell the firm, hey, if you don't agree to this wage increase, then we will do a strike for 7 days, right? And then if you look at the research, research finds out union workers, they generally earn about 10 or 20% more compared with non-union workers. The third reason that we have above equilibrium wages is due to efficiency wages. So efficiency wages basically imply that firms, they have the incentive to deliberately pay a higher wage above equilibrium. They want to do so because maybe they want to retain their workforce, so they want to reduce worker turnover, or they want to incentivize their workers by paying a higher wage. So they would imagine that by paying a higher wage, workers will work harder. So this could increase workers' effort. And the third reason is if you offer a higher wage above the market equilibrium, then you could attract better people, right? So by doing this, you can raise the quality of the labor force at your firm. Okay, define compensating differentials and give an example. So compensating differential is really the wage difference arising from non-monetary benefit, right? So the example is you can think about night shift and day shift at the same firm. These are essentially the same kind of jobs. However, night shift has some negative non-monetary attributes, right? Because you have to work at night. In this case, you can imagine that merely working at night could become undesirable. So in this case, the compensating differential has to be positive. That is, workers working night shift, they have to get a higher compensation to compensating these undesirable attributes from their night shift. Okay. Give 2 reasons why more educated workers earn more than less educated workers. So we could have 2 perspectives. The first is human capital, right? And the second is signaling. So in the human capital theory, you basically argue that if you have higher education, then you will accumulate more human capital. And more human capital means higher marginal product. This implies firm would be willing to pay you a higher wage. Signaling basically says that if you can obtain higher education, then this reveals that you're a smarter person and you have higher talent, you have higher ability. And of course, firms prefer a worker with higher talent. So in this case, you will be able to get a better job and get a higher wage. Okay, finally, so let's see the true-false questions. Evidence of, this one is not required. So labor unions will raise the quantity of labor demanded. This is definitely false, right? Because think about the labor demand. When we're talking about labor demand, who are the buyers of labor? Firms, right? And who are the supplier or sellers of labor? Workers, right? So you can see that labor unions will actually reduce the quantity of labor supplied. So the statement here is false. Okay, this one is not required. Okay, this one is not required. Efficiency wages will raise the quantity of labor supplied to the market. So think about this. Efficiency wages basically means the firm pays a wage which is higher than the equilibrium wage, right? So if you think about the supply curve, so if this is the equilibrium wage, and now the firm says, hey, I'm happy to pay the equilibrium wage. Sorry, I'm happy to pay the efficiency wage. This essentially means the firm will pay a higher wage, which is here. Let's call this maybe W prime, right? So clearly you can see that the quantity of labor supplied will increase. So you can see that this problem is true. Okay, that's for today's class.